So this is the context. So we've been working, a number of us in Mongolia for 10 years now. So this is the 10th anniversary, I think in June of our first trip going down. And we've been helping the Green Gold Mongolia, which is an NGO that was set up by the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation. And 80% of Mongolia is rangeland, 40% of folks are working in the livestock sector, 30% of the country is living in poverty, and that's probably actually higher at the moment because of their economic ties to China and the downturn. It's also a former Soviet satellite state. You can sort of see there it's sort of sandwiched between Russia and China. So there's been a lot of influence over the years. And because of the poverty, this has really been a major target for international donor support. Swiss Development Corporation, or the Swiss agency now, has put in over 21 million Swiss francs into their project in Mongolia over the last, it's like 13 years or so. And not all of that's rangeland, directly rangeland monitoring related, which is what we've been working on, a lot of development type stuff. And this was one of the major concerns for their livestock program. So following the collapse of the communist government in 1990, and then they privatized livestock in 1992, so it was all publicly owned, communally grazed rangeland, but under the Soviet system, everything was state property. Well, the land still continued to be state property, but they privatized livestock, and you can sort of see what happened after 1992. Big increases, but you see these black dots, these are really severe dzud years. And so these are years where there's usually a summer drought and the animals are in weakened condition, and then there's like a heavy snow winter or really cold winter, and there's usually a lot of mortality. They require lots of feed, sheds to keep them warm. Well, the Soviets provided all that kind of infrastructure and support broke down after the collapse of the communist government. So you can sort of see, the stocking rates were kind of kept at a fairly low level, and they survived the dzuds pretty well. These are probably less severe dzuds as well, so it's not entirely a clean story. But then you see these big declines after the subsequent, after the dzuds in the more recent years. So this is sort of a big issue for the economics and the well-being of the Mongolians that have attracted a lot of the international attention. And of course, there's this story, which is that one of the problems that ultimately underpins this is rangeland degradation. There was a New York Times article that described this and described a result coming out of this report that 70% of Mongolia's rangelands are degraded. The estimates in Mongolia have actually ranged from 9 to 90% in other publications. And those are kind of important. I just made the connection now, but those are important values to remember, 9 and 90%. Consensus on rangeland degradation is really a necessary step to motivate changes in rangeland policy. This was a decision that the Green Gold folks made back in 2005 and 2006. And so they called us. They actually called Jeff and Chris initially, and I was lucky enough to be able to get involved and go over in 2006 to help them with this problem. And so it began very slowly, as most things do over in Mongolia, with some mutton head to eat. That's Chris, I think, spitting out a piece into a napkin. There was a lot of lunchtime vodka. Here, there's Jeff, wondering if he has to drink another one. There was gift exchange, and then there was the signing of agreements with individuals. And one of the things that we were there to help with was a monitoring program. And this is really, I think, a key element to the success that we've had over there. You can blame the Soviets for a lot of things, but one of the things they did was, through their immense bureaucracy, was establish this amazing monitoring network of 1,450 points. Is actually more than that, but these are the ones that are operating well. with monitoring teams in each county, so each SUM. So there's like a couple of people that are actually involved in doing these measurements of a relatively few number of points in each SUM, and it's like 400 or so people that are employed to do this work alone, and monitor, and also meteorology data and other sorts of things. But there was little faith in those data due to problems with the methodology, and that's really what we were there ultimately to help with. And so there was the standardization of the national rangeland monitoring that was led by Justin with the training as well as with the standardization exercises. In 2008, there was an agreement to adopt line point intercept and the associated monitoring manual methods alongside soil characterization. There were trainings here. We had a couple of episodes there with folks coming over. And then they went back, sort of all of this was kind of ongoing at the same time. In 2009 to 2011, the training of the technicians at the National Agency for Environmental Monitoring. And here's where I think through this process, Justin and then Erica and Laura also working on the database. So getting the database translated over into Mongolian, also oversight for the training exercises, kind of keeping up with the changes in the green gold staff. There's a lot of turnover during this period. There's a lot of language barriers that keep the learning a bit slow at times, and Justin and Erica were there through it all. There was manuals and species codexes that were produced. We have some of this stuff. It's really beautifully done. It's actually, through this whole process, they have stuff I wish we had here in the U.S. now. It's really been quite remarkable, the effort that they've put in. And then meanwhile, we were also thinking about, well, we need some framework to interpret the monitoring data. And so this is the development of ecological site descriptions and state and transition models. So while they were doing the training, and this is again, I think Justin dug just about every one. If you just imagine those black dots as holes in the ground, I think Justin dug, 663 plots in the data set. And a lot of those holes were dug by Justin. There's also vegetation measurements that included some of those NAMM monitoring points, but also other areas that may have been reference or healthy conditions and extremely degraded conditions that would help us to develop the state and transition models. So that was ongoing from 2009 to 2014. We also invented Mexican, Mongolian fusion cuisine, brought over some salsa huichol and some other select sauces, chiltepin sauce, that was a really good one, and it goes really good with kushur, and they in turn exposed us to all sorts of interesting cuisine as well, like boiled goose that came out of the lake next door, and that's me with my excited face anticipating that meal. And there's the hot sauce again. Justin became very good at learning the sort of customary way to cut the mutton off the bone and also to accept an offer of vodka. And that is me holding a boiled roasted marmot head by its incisors. I did not take that bite. Didn't take it. So this is the product from that work. This is 25 ecological site groups across Mongolia, very logically organized and associated with dominant vegetation. We did multivariate analyses to sort of get us an idea of what the kinds of states were, and also a little bit of local knowledge from the herders and a lot of the technicians to figure out where the important breaks were from a management standpoint. And these are the products. So we have this on the web page. It's all in Mongolian now. We have some of the English translated, but not nearly as much information. But these are really good models. They're data-based. They're simple. They actually reflect what's out there. You could take this model like a key and go to a piece of ground and find one of these plant communities on that site. In part, it's a simpler system, but these are really well-informed models. and easy to use. And so with that, then we went, so that's from the 663 points and all the other work we did. Now we had to go back to that monitoring data, which had been gathered for a couple of years, and interpret those monitoring points and communicate this very simply to the Mongolian government. And it's very hard to do. We have 25 state and transition models, and each of those has 4 or 5 states. So what do? What we decided on was what we call a recovery class, which works across all those models, and that's what each of these colors is. Blue, which is 1, is like 1 to 3 years, we estimate, of grazing management to recover the reference condition, the reference state. 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and greater than 10 years or never. These values for timelines to recovery are informed primarily by expert knowledge of the botanists, but there's also a limited number of data sets that span that time period that we could go to. And seem reasonable from the standpoint of what we know about how rangelands and these species work. And so what we discovered, of course, was that a vast majority of these could be recovered in a very short amount of time. And this kind of goes back to that 9 to 90%. If we say 90% is degraded, well, 90% of it is largely a little degraded. 9% is pretty close to desertified, or going to have a really hard time recovering ever. So it sort of depends upon what your definition of degradation is, how you would interpret. But that's just a very not useful way of viewing the process. I think this gives us some ideas about what sorts of interventions and how long should we expect for recovery to occur. We have all this online. What's really cool, this is something that Jeb Williamson helped put together. Each point is associated, each monitoring point has a state and transition model. You can click on it. The state and transition model comes up that designates which phase of which state it belongs to, and then there's a photo from that year. And so now the Mongolians are going to update this periodically as sort of a state of Mongolian rangeland health with this kind of a tool on their website. So the new interpretation is that degradation is occurring, certainly many areas at risk, but management actions now could be very helpful. And so this is sort of where we're at in the last couple of years, this idea of resilience-based management, that you can control seasonal stocking rates in order to restore degraded states and sustain desired states. And so basically what happens is folks get around, they could use tablets or whatever, they put the posters of the state and transition models on the side of the SUV. There's Justin there supervising the process. And with that, they sort of discuss the management plans for this communal area that they're managing. And this is an example of one of these pasture management plans that were developed for one of these counties or SUMs, Undusrit, where we've done a lot of more intensive work. And so each of these zones here is a different group of families, and then there's a lot of data about where the spring and summer camps are, and then what the current and what the recommended stocking rates ought to be for those. And so then we bundled up this past year all of these ideas, the state transition models, ecological sites, stocking rate recommendations, harvest efficiencies into a national report, and then went on the media blitz. This is the Minister of Agriculture talking about this stuff in the Parliament building, and a lot of the Green Gold staff at a conference, and I even got on Bloomberg on the financial news segment. And so this, as a consequence, I think, of a lot of that previous work and a lot of their pushing and the media attention, that process was approved by the national government, and they're pushing these rangeland use agreements at the local level. So we'll see how it works from here. This is just some reflections on that whole process. Patience. You couldn't do this in a couple of years. I mean, there's just no way you can go through this process. There's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of language barriers, there's a lot of personal relationships that have to be established. And so it definitely takes time, and you have to view this kind of activity as a long-term process. Certainly you need long-term funding. So the Green Gold, they went through all kinds of turnover, but they finally got a core group of people who could sort of build along and make these connections. And that took the Swiss government and their persistent funding to do that. Certainly personal relationships, you're learning as you're teaching in this kind of a situation, especially for a scientist who doesn't necessarily know very much about the context within which rangeland management is occurring. And Justin's personal relationships and Erica's with a lot of the Green Gold staff made all the difference for getting understanding of these very complex tools across. Then there are what the folks in literature call boundary spanners. These are people who connect different stakeholder groups or different kinds of people together, and Bulgama and Enki, two of the leaders of that Green Gold program, did an amazing job of connecting policymakers and parliament members, all the way through to herders and us and the funders. And it's really pretty astounding when you think about the amount of time and effort and politics needed to do that. And then, of course, our team here. And finally, I think sort of a little bit of humility in recognizing that ecological science is really just part of a bigger picture, and it's our obligation, I think, to continue to find ways to make it relevant.